Hello and welcome to the New Books Network Jewish Studies channel. I am your host, Rora Rusi, Executive Director of Unity Through Diversity Institute, where we explore the future of our heritage. Today, we are really delighted to speak with Yardena Schwartz about her book, Ghosts of a Holy War, the 1929 massacre in Palestine that ignited the Arab-Israeli conflict, published by Union Square and Company in 2024. Welcome, Yardena, and thank you for joining us here today.
Thank you for having me.
We usually start by asking our authors to tell us a little bit about themselves and their areas of research. And you're a journalist, as I understand it. Can you give us a little bit of background about yourself?
I began my career as a journalist in TV news. I was a producer at MSNBC. Before that, I was working at NBC News, ABC News, and in 2013, I quit my job at MSNBC to become a freelance correspondent in Tel Aviv. So I moved to Tel Aviv, lived there for 10 years, reported for dozens of publications, including Time Magazine, Foreign Policy, Newsweek, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal. And in 2023, I moved back to the States, where I live now. I live in the Hudson Valley with my family. And Ghosts of a Holy War is my first book. I started writing it when I was still living in Tel Aviv, and spent 5 years working on it. And yeah, I think that's about it.
That's a good overview. We'll get into some of the details, I'm sure, as we continue to talk. But let's try to understand this particular journey about this, as you call it, as you say, your first book. And I love that it came from Letters in the Attic. I just think that that's such a wonderful start to any type of story. So, can you tell us a little bit about how you came to fall into this book in some way?
Yeah, it was really every writer's dream because the letters really found me. A family in Memphis, Tennessee was moving out of their home and found in their attic a box filled with letters from the late 1920s written by their late uncle, who they had never met because he had been killed in this massacre in Hebron in 1929 in what was then British Mandate Palestine. And the family, of course, knew about their uncle. They knew that he had been killed in this massacre. But these hundreds of pages of his letters really opened a window not only into his life and who he was and what drove him to move there from Memphis, of all places, but also was a window into this place that had been lost to time. The Hebron that he described in his letters was unrecognizable from the Hebron we know today. At the time, it was this beacon of coexistence in Palestine, a place where Jews and Muslims have lived side by side in peace for generations. And this family, after reading his letters, they realized they were sitting on this treasure trove of history and decided they wanted to get them into the hands of an author, journalist who could really do something with them. And they actually first contacted Yossi Klein Halevi, an incredible author,
Yes.
also American Israeli. And he couldn't take it on for several reasons, but he promised the family that he would find someone who could. And I'm honored that he asked me if I was interested in telling their story, in meeting this family, and of course I said yes. And over the course of the next few months, I spent my time really just reading all of his letters, and then from there, I began my journey into Hebron to really discover not only more about the massacre itself and what caused it, but also the impact it had. And I realized throughout my research in Hebron that you really cannot understand Hebron or the conflict itself without understanding what happened, what led to this massacre, and what followed from that massacre.
Right. And I think that's a very important part of the book as well, as you put it in context across generations. And I think that's also, we'll get back into more modern afterwards, but you put it also into the context of ancient history, the Abraham's burial ground. Um, for those who don't know, that's where it's the traditionally located. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. It's the cave of, what's it called in
The
English?
tomb, the tomb of the patriarchs and matriarchs.
Tomb of Patriarchs and Matriarchs. Sorry about that. Marat Machpelah in Hebrew is the way I'm used to having it. Um, but yeah, so it's become a focal point in general and part of this holy war, if you want to call it that. So you mentioned that there was this turning point around 1929. Do you want to just address that a little bit before we get into David?
So the turning point in 1929 was when the forces that drive this conflict today really came to the foreground. So until 1929, the Temple Mount, Al-Aqsa Mosque, things that we hear about in the context of this conflict all the time, before 1929, those weren't really issues. There had not been a clash over rights to pray at the Temple Mount and who owns the Temple Mount until 1929. And what happened was that actually it was a bit before 1929, in late 1928, around the same time that this young man from Memphis arrived in Palestine. His name was David Chainberg. He arrived in September 1928, just weeks after there was this violent clash at the Western Wall, the last remnant of the ancient Jewish temple, upon which Al-Aqsa Mosque was built 700 years later with the advent of Islam. So the Temple Mount at the time was owned and controlled by the Muslim authorities. And the Jews were forbidden from praying, from even going to the Temple Mount. The only place they could go or pray was this tiny little alleyway along the Western Wall. And so Jews had always prayed there, and suddenly they were forbidden from bringing certain things that they used during their services on Yom Kippur, the most somber day on the Jewish calendar, one of the one of the holiest days in the Jewish year. When Jews would pray there, they would usually put a divider between the sexes, so men on one side, women on the other. And this had been done for years. It had even been done months earlier, but this time the Muslim authorities balked and went to the British authorities who ruled Palestine and told them that the Jews are trying to turn the Western Wall into a synagogue. They're trying to take over the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And all of this was part of a campaign of propaganda and disinformation carried out by the man who was the most important Muslim official in Palestine at the time, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini, who would go on to become the most influential Arab leader in Palestine. He started this rumor that the Jews of Palestine, a small minority at the time, but the majority in Jerusalem, were planning to destroy Al-Aqsa Mosque to rebuild their ancient temple. And his really absurd allegation was taken seriously by many Muslims in Palestine. And over the course of that year, imams and Muslim clerics in mosques across the country repeated that lie, and it was repeated by the Arabic press. It was circulated in leaflets and pamphlets. He even used elements of the protocols of the elders of Zion to prove his claim. Apparently, he didn't know that it was a forgery, or he did know and didn't care. But over the course of the following year, that lie, that rumor, and that propaganda really took hold of the population, and it led to this outburst of violence that had not been seen in hundreds of years in Palestine. After the massacre in Hebron, the British High Commissioner of Palestine, so the leading British official in Palestine, when he visited Hebron and saw, the blood-soaked walls and floors and, what had been done in Hebron, he wrote that history had not seen barbarity like this in hundreds of years, because the violence that was unleashed against the peaceful Jewish community of Hebron was just horrific.
So we jumped ahead. I want to make sure that we build up to that. Let's go back to late 1928. Late 1928. We have the imams are getting fed this information, which there's no reason they shouldn't believe because the Grand Mufti is saying it, that the Jews are trying to take over the Temple Mount. And this is also seeping into Hebron. And then you have this sweet guy from Memphis, not a political Zionist in any way, shape, or form from what you described him. He wanted to go study in a yeshiva. There was a very prominent yeshiva in Hebron at the time, which now the Yeshiva of Hebron is based in Jerusalem. Kind of a funny thing, but anyway,
As a
um,
direct result of the
of
massacre, it was
this,
actually
yeah.
forced to relocate immediately in the days after, and
But they
it's
kept their
still in
name
Jerusalem now. Yeah,
because there's a different yeshiva in Hebron, but it's different. Um,
right.
but anyway, let's introduce us now to David a little bit. Can you tell us a little bit about his background and who he is?
So David Schoenberg was 22 years old when he sailed from New York Harbor to Palestine. But he grew up in Memphis. He was the son of two Jewish immigrants from the Ukraine who had fled the Ukraine with their families following the pogroms and anti-Semitism that led hundreds of thousands of Jews to flee Eastern Europe long before the Holocaust. His parents arrived penniless, but his father actually became a very successful merchant in Memphis, and he opened his own little retail shop that turned into this chain of retail stores across Memphis and the mid and the South. And so David was actually expected to continue in his father's footsteps to work in the family business. He ended up going to Wharton after graduating from high school. Was a very, very intelligent guy, very, very wise beyond his years in his letters, and even in his diary, which I read from before he moved to Hebron. It felt as if I was reading the words of a 60-year-old. He was so wise, and so very spiritual as well. His parents, although they were Jewish, they were not quite secular, but not very religious. They worked on Shabbat, on the Jewish Sabbath. And David had also been working at the store on the Sabbath until he became much more connected with his Jewish heritage and his Jewish roots, thanks to his local rabbi. And he told his parents he was not going to work on Shabbat anymore. He even managed to convince his father not to work on Shabbat, which was a big deal because most of the people who were shopping at his store were coming on Shabbat, so he was losing out in business. But David just became really infatuated with Jewish history, and he wanted to learn more about, he wanted to learn Torah. So that was what brought him to New York. And he was living there for a year, doing different study classes, study groups, going to different yeshivas. And he just never really felt like he was getting the experience he wanted. He really wanted to immerse himself in the Torah and the Hebrew Bible, almost like a Jewish monk. And that's why he chose Hebron, because it was this place that was untouched by time. People still got around by horse and carriage. Men rode around on their mules. He described in his letters this place that was just light years behind Memphis, and that environment enabled him to really do the kind of study he wanted to do. He had never really wrote in his letters that he intended to become a rabbi or that he went to this yeshiva to become a rabbi, but it was very clear that that was his trajectory from the way he was progressing. He was one of the most advanced students at the yeshiva, despite coming from a relatively irreligious background. Most of the students at his school came from very religious families, whether they were from America or from Europe or from Palestine. By the way, the Jews of Palestine at the time were also described as Palestinians. When he
Sure.
described native Jews of Palestine, he called them Palestinians. And his letters are written, Hebron, Palestine. But he really just you could see the transformation from the diary entries when he was in New York, feeling just so unfulfilled and unsatisfied, and as if his life was very superficial. To when he was writing from Hebron, he was just euphoric. Every day was a gift to him. Every lesson he learned, every morsel of knowledge he acquired at the yeshiva was just so valuable to him. And he was trying to convince his family in his letters to move there with him. You mentioned this in your question, but one of the most interesting things to me when I first read David's letters was the fact that he was an anti-Zionist. He described the Zionist movement as this vile anti-Jewish cause. And yet here he was talking about how fulfilled he was and how he had never been happier than living in his people's ancient homeland. And so it's really interesting how Zionism has transformed from what it was then to what it was today, because then the reason he described it as this vile anti-Jewish movement was because it was led in for the most part by secular men who were not religious, were not referring to the Torah. They were referring to, very secular attitudes surrounding nationhood, about the right of the Jewish people to determine their own fate. And for him and for many traditional Jews at the time, the return of the Jewish masses to Zion, to the land of Israel, should only be achieved through the will of God, the arrival of the Mashiach, the Messiah. And what's interesting is that what I saw and what I learned through my research and my reporting was that the massacre that took David's life convinced many traditional religious anti-Zionists at the time to become Zionists. And I always wondered if David had survived, had he not been killed in this massacre, if he too would have changed his mind about Zionism and decided that, the Jews really did need their own state and to determine their own fate.
Right. So I guess we'll skip ahead for a minute since you brought that up. That they were living there, as you mentioned, in peace. They had Arabs and Jews were doing business with each other. One had a store, one had other things, and they were helping each other, and it was very open. And then things started to change. Um, Actually, let's take a step back first. Yes, it was open, but yes, there was still the concept of separate areas in terms of, like you mentioned, the Western Wall, and in Hebron, Jews could only go up to the seventh step. So can you just tell us what that is before we?
Right. So Jews in general in Palestine and especially in Hebron were essentially second class citizens. The Muslims were the majority. They often ran the city councils. In Hebron, there was just one Jew on the city council. The Tomb of the Patriarchs, the burial place of the forefathers and mothers of the Jewish people, Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Leah. It was off limits to Jews. It had become a mosque after Jerusalem was conquered by Muslims. Actually, it was in the 12th century that Muslim rulers forbid non-Muslims from entering, and that was true until 1967. So for 700 years, only Muslims were permitted to enter the Tomb of the Patriarchs and Matriarchs, known in Arabic as the Ibrahimi Mosque. But nevertheless, the Jews who lived in Hebron, the entire reason they were there was to live near the Tomb of the Patriarchs and Matriarchs. So they visited every day and prayed there every day, but the closest they could get to the tomb was the seventh step of the staircase outside. So often they would stand there praying. Sometimes young Muslims at the mosque would throw rocks at them, curse at them, spit at them. David wrote in his letters that sometimes elderly rabbis would have their beards pulled by, a young Arab running by. But the Jews who were living there, they had been used to that for centuries. I mean, to them, this was just a part of living as a minority in just like in many other places, by the way. I mean, in Europe too, where Jews were living as minorities, they too were mistreated. So it was just something they were accustomed to. It was something that they didn't know anything else. Jews had not been the majority in any country they lived in. And, so when they spoke about these peaceful relations, it was a relative peace.
Right.
It was, it wasn't perfect. But, it's, when you think about what Hebron is like today, it was very different. You had Jews and Arabs sitting and having coffee together, owning businesses together. Many of the Jews in Hebron were renting their homes from Arab landlords. And in fact, when the massacre, even before the riots began in Hebron, many of the warnings that the Jews of Hebron received were from their Arab friends. And they didn't believe them, by the way. When the Haganah, the underground Jewish defense force that predated the IDF, when members of the Haganah came to Hebron to warn the Jewish leaders of Hebron that riots were going to break out. They were going to come to Hebron. The Jewish leaders of Hebron were unanimous in their denial. They said that it won't happen here. Our Arab neighbors are our friends. If anything happens, they'll protect us. They told the Haganah men how in previous rounds of violence elsewhere in Jerusalem or Jaffa, the riots never reached Hebron because of these relationships that they had. And in fact, the morning that the massacre took place in Hebron, there were, Muslim friends of these same leaders who insisted to the Haganah that they would be protected. Those friends did come to their homes to protect them. In some cases, they stayed. In some cases, they left or even joined the rioters. But the day of the massacre, at least 250 Jews were saved by their Muslim neighbors who hid them in their homes, stood out guard outside of theirs. But sadly, 67 unarmed Jewish men, women, and children were slaughtered in the most horrific of ways.
Yeah, I need a minute for that, but so I want to go back to this anti-Zionist for a minute because the Haganah not being allowed in my mind, also plays into that. They didn't want these,
Absolutely.
you know, these people
These
that
armed men, yeah, they said, armed men that the Arabs here don't know will only provoke them. David wasn't the only anti-Zionist in Hebron. Hebron was not a Zionist community. It was a community of pious Jews, almost all of them highly religious, living a quiet existence centered around the Torah. They weren't building the foundations of a Jewish state on their backs. They were fine with living as second class citizens, fine with, none of them challenged this status quo in Hebron in which they couldn't even enter the tomb of the patriarch.
right.
And yet these were the people who were slaughtered. Many of them, by the way, were native Arabic speaking natives of Palestine. Many of them were Mizrahi Jews, Sephardi Jews who had been in Palestine for generations. Many of them had come, many of their families had come from Spain or, provinces of where the Inquisition was leading them to flee, whether it was Italy, Greece, Spain, but there were also many Jews there who had come from Baghdad, from Turkey. So, this wasn't, many of the Jews who were killed that day also were natives,
Of the Middle
Arabic
East or Northern
speakers.
Africa.
Yeah, yeah.
So let's go back to kind of the figure who started it all, although it's obviously much more complicated than that. But let's go back to the Grand Mufti for a minute. And I don't mean to simplify it by saying he's the reason, but his
No, he was. I think it's
propaganda
safe to say that.
definitely.
Yeah.
Can you
Mhm.
help us understand who he is? We know about him in the 40s as well. Um, there's much, I want everybody to be sure there is much more in the book, and the book is also a great read because it's the story of a person and how he sees it as well. And personally, to me, that's a wonderful way to understand the situation, but it's so much more than that. So can you give us a little insight into the Grand Mufti?
So the Grand Mufti Haj Amina Husseini was from one of the most powerful families or clans in Palestine at the time, the Al Husseini clan. It was that family and another clan that essentially ruled life among the Muslims of Palestine at the time, and especially before the British took control of Palestine after World War One with the fall of the Ottoman Empire. So he was the son of a mufti of Jerusalem. This was, the mufti is essentially the equivalent of the chief rabbi of Palestine. He's the most important Muslim official in the land. His half brother had been mufti before him. Nevertheless, he wasn't a shoo-in for that position. It wasn't a hereditary role. It was something that you had to be elected to. He had actually come in last in the election, but in a curious use of his best judgment, the High Commissioner of Palestine at the time, the first British High Commissioner of Palestine, who was actually Jewish and
Yep.
Zionist, Herbert Samuel, managed to appoint Haj Amin al-Husseini to the post. He mistakenly believed that it was best to keep your enemies closer. He was already this virulent anti-Zionist, very outspoken anti-Semite. He had already actually been handed an arrest warrant after a previous riot that he incited in 1920. Herbert Samuel pardoned him, allowing him to return from his exile in Jordan, where he had been hiding with Bedouin tribes. And he assumed the position and became overnight the most important Muslim official in the land. He also became the president of the Supreme Muslim Council, which was also created by the British as sort of a centralized body to oversee all Muslim holy sites and Sharia courts. And so with that post, he now oversaw the Western Wall. And this is why he was able to prevent Jews from using these, dividers during their services. He also initiated all kinds of building projects at the Western Wall to prevent Jews from accessing the holiest site they were permitted to pray. And all of that created this friction where you not only did you have the propaganda and the incitement he was carrying out against the Jewish community, claiming that they were trying to destroy Al-Aqsa to rebuild their temple, but he was also preventing them from accessing the Western Wall. So this created a movement within the Jewish community in Jerusalem as well to counter those efforts and to appeal to the British for freedom of worship, for access to the Western Wall. And so the Mufti was able to use those calls and those appeals to the British and efforts by the Jews to actually buy the Western Wall so they could control their own access and pray freely. And he was able to use that and say to his people, look, what I'm telling you is true. Look, they're trying to buy it. They're trying to take over Al-Aqsa because the Western Wall was, of course, essentially part of the Temple Mount as well. And so the Mufti, he was really brilliant at propaganda, so brilliant that later, after inciting these riots in 1929, he incited other riots as well, and he oversaw the Great Arab Revolt from 1936 to 1939. It was actually a grassroots effort in the beginning, but he took credit for it and then quickly took over it. And after that revolt against the British, the British tried to arrest him. Again, he fled, but this time he ended up in Berlin, where he was based from 1941 to 1945. He pledged his allegiance to the Nazis, and pledged the support of the Palestinian Arabs to the cause of the Nazis and to the cause of exterminating the Jews of Europe. And he hoped and he asked Hitler in his meeting with him in 1949 to bring those solutions to Palestine and to help him solve Palestine's Jewish problem. Hitler was happy to take his support. He told them, we're not quite ready for state building yet to help build, an Arab state in Palestine. But, he told Husseini, he told the Grand Mufti that he would become the most important Muslim voice for the Nazis. And he did. He ended up leading the Arab branch of Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda. And he broadcast the most despicable, vile anti-Jewish messages throughout the Muslim world, throughout the Holocaust. So he kind of fused these Islamic messages with Nazi propaganda to kind of adapt it to the Arab world. And throughout World War II, he was based in a Nazi-financed mansion in Berlin. He was paid the equivalent of millions of dollars to host other Arab leaders who would visit Berlin, and he recruited tens of thousands of Muslims to fight for the Nazis. He even tried and failed to carry out a Nazi operation in Palestine. It was called Operation Atlas. And it only failed because the British caught these people who parachuted into Palestine with the goal of poisoning the water of Tel Aviv. And they caught them thanks to actually local Arabs who told the British that they saw some suspicious people falling from the sky. But he would have, had that operation not failed, we can only imagine what he would have done in Palestine. But when World War II ended, The Grand Mufti was wanted for Nazi war crimes. He was placed on the UN's list of Nazi war criminals. And yet, once again, he fled first to France. The British wanted to extradite him from France to try him for war crimes and to try him for the deaths of British officials in Palestine. And the French refused. They didn't want to anger their Arab allies. And with the help of several Arab diplomats in Paris, the Grand Mufti managed to leave Paris, ended up in Cairo, where he met his cousin Yasser Arafat, who would become his leading disciple. And eventually, both of them moved to Beirut. But before 1948, before the establishment of Israel, the Grand Mufti continued to pull the strings of the anti-Jewish movement in Palestine. And when the UN voted to partition Palestine, to end the British mandate for Palestine, to end British rule, and to give independence to the Arabs and Jews of Palestine by creating an independent Arab state and an independent Jewish state, the Jewish leaders of Palestine embraced that plan, but the Grand Mufti and every other Arab leader adamantly rejected it and declared war against the Jews of Palestine. So we always speak about the War of 1948, but that war actually began the day after the 1947 UN vote in November of 1947 with deadly riots in Jerusalem that were incited by Arab officials, not only by the Grand Mufti, but by the the Arab Executive Committee, which was chaired by associates of the Grand Mufti who agreed with him that there could be no Jewish sovereignty in a land that they claimed was and will always be Muslim. So it wasn't about rejecting outside rule. It was, they were fine when it was ruled by the Ottomans. They were fine when it was ruled by the Egyptians, so long as it remained Muslim land. A place where Jews were second-class citizens. They did not want to allow Jews to become equals, and that was very clear in all of the statements that the Grand Mufti made and that other Arab officials in Palestine made in the aftermath of that UN vote. And the Grand Mufti actually established an army called the Army of the Holy War. This is why my book is called Ghosts of the Holy War, because this really has always been a holy war. For the Holy Land. And, if you listen to the words of Arab officials today, such as Hamas and Fatah, they're all using, very religious language when they describe this conflict. It's not, for them, it's not about land or rights. It's very much about what it was always about, that, to these Arab officials, this is Muslim land, holy Muslim land, and to give any part of it to Jews, and for Jews to have sovereignty in any part of this land is a curse against Allah, a curse against Islam. And so, I think that the reason why these letters and this story really spoke to me was because so much of this conflict is described as complicated and really hard to understand. But when you look at this massacre a century ago and you see how similar it is to what's happening today, you realize it's really not that complicated. Like, it has always been very clear what this conflict has been about. And if you solve these problems of, weaponization of Islam, incitement, and disinformation, only then you'll be able to really crack the code of peace here. And sadly, a lot of the peace efforts haven't addressed those issues.
So I do want to get into that, but I want to first put it back into what we say the history is repeating itself, and you're talking about 100 years ago and before. But one of the things that I got goosebumps in reading the book is in David's last letter home on August 20th, 1929. And I'm going to quote from your book. He was visiting, he wrote about a visit to the Western Wall in Jerusalem, and he said, as we walked along Jerusalem streets, we could almost imagine the streams of Jewish blood flowing at our feet, the horrible scenes of slaughter, Jewish sages, budding youth, tender babes in their mother's arms, all killed by the barbaric sword of the enemy. And then a few days later in Hebron, that's literally what was there. And he's talking about thousands of years before.
Yeah, he was describing the Romans conquering Jerusalem and banishing the Jews of Jerusalem. Yeah.
And it's just that really gave me the goosebumps. But so let's go back to what you're talking about, and because it's so pertinent today, in particular, because an article just came out about Sheikh Jabari in Hebron, who is talking about building an emirate. He wants to join Israel, or at least join the Abraham Accords to have peace with them. And I'm assuming it's the same clans that were there, or the same tribes that were there from 1929. These are people that have a long history in the land. They have a history of good relationships with their Jewish neighbors. And the concept of the Emirates, how do you see that in the context of what we've been talking about as a journalist?
So when I first saw this news, first of all, I was shocked. In my years of reporting in Hebron, I had never heard of this concept. I had actually never heard of this specific sheikh, and I thought, okay, maybe I missed something. And I was also, very hopeful when I read of it, of course. But sadly, my reporting and my research and my conversations with my sources in Hebron, including members of the Jabari family, apparently this sheikh does not even live in Hebron. Most
Hmm,
people in Hebron have never heard of him, so there was a reason why I'd never heard of him.
interesting.
He's not the leader of the Jabari clan, which he claims to be. In this article, it describes him as speaking on behalf of 300,000 people.
Hmm.
He doesn't seem to speak for anyone but himself, unfortunately. And
And the
so,
13 other sheikhs that have signed it?
um, so, so no, so it was signed by five sheikhs, including this Jabari, and it's now backed by 13 others. But it doesn't seem that as if anybody in Hebron was consulted, aside from these people who don't really have much sway in Hebron. Hebron is home to 350,000 Arabs. And I think that if they were consulted and if, this was a decision that was voted on, that would be one thing. But these people seem to have made this decision on their own. And it doesn't seem to be supported by the people of Hebron. So I think um, it's a bit too soon to get behind it or to get very hopeful that it's actually going to happen. I'd love to see something like this happen. But at the same time, it doesn't really answer what a peace initiative would need to answer, which is what happens then to the Arabs living in Hebron? Are they then allowed to freely travel through Israel? Will they be able to travel from Hebron to other parts of the West Bank? Because right now, I mean, most of the residents of Hebron can't visit their family and friends in other Palestinian cities because they need special permission, or they need special permission even to go to the different parts of Hebron, since Hebron is, 80% is ruled by the Palestinian Authority, 20% is ruled by Israel. And there are 35,000 Palestinians living on the Israeli side who are not citizens of Israel, who, on the same street where they live, the people across the street can drive their cars on their street, can park their car in front of their homes, yet they cannot drive on their own street. They have to
Right.
park their cars on the Palestinian side and then cross a checkpoint, so these things, all of these issues need to also be addressed. And they seem to just gloss over all of those issues of, Palestinian freedom of movement, things like that, that will need to be addressed in any kind of peace plan. Of course, the recognition of Israel and the pledge for peace is a very important part of a peace plan as well, but it's just a very small part. And I think that the fact that this plan completely ignores any kind of rights for Palestinians as well, I think is a reason why it's being dismissed as kind of a non-starter by many of the Arabs in Hebron.
I think maybe people want to hear some good news and want to
Exactly.
have some optimism. And we talked a lot about the massacres and everything. The, this is, as you said, has many moving parts, this whole conflict, and it's been for centuries, if not millennia. although within the Muslim context, just centuries. Um, what do you want people to walk away with after reading this book?
I want people to understand that it doesn't have to be this way. We're not doomed to endless rounds of conflict and violence. There is a path for peace if we're willing to do the hard work of tackling incitement, tackling disinformation, and the weaponization of Islam. I mean, many of the imams in mosques, even within Israel, in Jerusalem, are still repeating those same lies about a Jewish plot to destroy Al-Aqsa. There's a reason why October 7th was named by Hamas as the Al-Aqsa flood. It was described as, an effort to liberate Al-Aqsa. And so, and that's one message I want people to walk away with, but also the idea that there are Palestinian moderates and peace seekers, and there have been for years. And these are the people we need to work with, not sheikhs who no one has ever heard of and who don't really have any, mandate from their own people. There are young Palestinian leaders who want a new kind of leadership that isn't going to continue to say no to two states for two people. We didn't speak about this, but the Grand Mufti, he was the first Palestinian leader to reject a two-state solution back in 1937 when it was proposed by the British, again in 1947 when it was proposed by the UN. But we've seen that pattern of rejectionism from every Palestinian leader since then. So in 2000, it was Yasser Arafat who said no to a two-state solution and an independent, peaceful Palestinian state alongside Israel. Then Mahmoud Abbas, who is still the leader of the Palestinian Authority, he turned down an even more generous offer in 2008. Yet there are young Palestinian leaders who could be the future leadership of the Palestinian people who do want two states for two people, who do believe in coexistence, who do recognize the need for self-determination for Israelis and Palestinians alike. So these leaders do exist, and it's just a matter of elevating them, empowering them, and working with them. If it's possible to find some sheikh in Hebron who claims to represent 300,000 people, but who's nobody has ever heard of, if people are willing to get behind that kind of person, then I don't see why they can't get behind, a young Palestinian leader like Ahmed Fouad al-Khatib, Hamza Houidi, Ali Abu Awad, Khaled Abu Awad, Mahmoud Jabari. Like I could, name so many people who do have the kind of name recognition and legitimacy and seriousness that these sheikhs who signed this letter don't have. Apparently, many of them are businessmen who have been involved in this plan with the economic minister of Israel for years. They're not people who are actually working towards peace. They're not peace activists. There are peace activists in Palestinian society.
But economics is as good of a reason to make peace as any. I don't know. I have no problem with economics being a main. Sorry,
it's
that was
one part.
personal.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's one part. The thing is, I mean, part of this plan, if you look at what the Palestinians get in return, it's 1,000 work permits.
It's to start
this
with.
is
Yeah.
what they're getting. Yeah, and then 5,000. I mean, there's 350,000 Palestinians in Hebron. Before October 7th, there were 250,000 Palestinians working within Israel. I mean, there's a reason why those work permits were revoked. Very good reasons why those work permits were revoked. But I mean, it's just one of many reasons why this plan is not very workable plan. For there to be united Emirates of Palestine, they're going to need to be contiguous and not little islands that won't be able to travel outside of those small enclaves. There's going to need to be some kind of connecting, basis for those Emirates. It was just described as being along the model of the United Arab Emirates. I mean, if you look at the United Arab Emirates, it's a huge area, and it's all one piece. It's not, like a bunch of little regions that aren't connected to each other. So I do think peace is possible. And, this is a hopeful sign, even though it's not a very workable plan. I think it's it's pointing to a recognition that the Palestinians need new leadership, new thinking is required. And, I hope that this just opens doors for other better ideas.
Thank you. So at the New Books Network, we always have to ask, what are you working on now? So I know there's a lot of news out there, a lot of things going on out there. Any new letters fall into your lap? New person?
No new letters yet, but I am starting to work on a new project. I can't really say much about it,
Okay.
but hopefully I will be able to soon. And for now, I'm just still just getting the word out about the book. So thank you for having me on to help me do that. And also focusing on raising my two little kids who were both born while I was writing this book. So my daughter
Oh.
was born in 2020, shortly after I began my research in Hebron. And then my son was born in 2022, after I got the book deal and started actually writing the manuscript. So they're 2.5 and 5 now. So I've got my hands full.
Okay, you sound a little busy. That's a big project. That's your next project too, or your continuing
Yeah,
project. So
exactly.
we look forward to hearing about the other project as well. And thank you for joining us. We have been speaking with Yardena Schwartz about her book, Ghosts of a Holy War, the 1929 massacre in Palestine that ignited the Arab-Israeli conflict, published by Union Square and Company in 2024. It has been a true pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And to continue exploring the diversity of the Jewish people, follow Jewish Unity through Diversity Institute on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, and our podcast, Reclaiming Identity.